the Olympian Heresy. The vox-grille crackled with static before the transmission cut to silence. And in that moment, I understood that everything we believed about the Immaterium was a lie. The warp does not simply reflect our nightmares and hungers. It remembers. It resurrects. And what it has brought forth from the grave of human memory should have remained buried forever. My name is Inquisitor Hadrian Vex of the Ordo Malleus, and I am writing this account from the observation deck of the strike cruiser Eternal Vigil, my hands trembling not from age or fear, but from the weight of knowledge that no servant of the Golden Throne should ever bear. Before me, suspended in the shifting madness of the warp, hangs an impossibility. A mountain that should not exist. A pantheon that humanity abandoned 10,000 years before the Emperor walked upon Terra. The warp has given birth to something ancient, something that predates the Imperium itself. And I fear we are witnessing the beginning of a heresy so profound that it will shake the foundations of everything we hold sacred. It began 3 months ago in the Hesperides Sector, a collection of agri worlds and forge installations along the eastern fringe of Segmentum Tempestus. The astropathic choirs reported disturbances, nothing unusual for a region so close to unstable warp currents. But then, the messages changed. The psychers were not screaming about demons or the usual predations of the Ruinous Powers. They spoke of voices singing in a tongue that had not been heard since old Earth's classical antiquity. They described visions of marble columns rising from seas of Empyrean fire, of beings wearing golden laurels who commanded lightning, and rode chariots pulled by creatures that were not horses, but something older, something primal. The Administratum dismissed these reports as the ravings of minds touched by warp exposure, standard procedure for astropaths who stare too long into the abyss. But when 3 entire choirs fell silent within the same solar week, the Inquisition took notice. I was summoned to the Chamber of Vigilance on Holy Terra, a room deep within the inquisitorial fortress, where only the most disturbing cases are discussed. Lord Inquisitor Matthias Carde himself briefed me, his augmetic eye flickering with data streams as he spoke. He told me that navigator houses were refusing to transit through the Hesperides sector, claiming they could see something in the warp that should not be there. A structure of impossible geometry and beauty that called to them with promises of knowledge and power. Several navigators who had gazed too long at this phenomenon had gone mad, tearing out their third eyes and babbling about gods who were not the Emperor. Gods who offered gifts without the taint of chaos. Gods who remembered when humanity worshipped beneath open skies rather than in the darkness of hive cities. The Ordo Malleus deployed immediately. We assembled a strike force of Grey Knights, those incorruptible warrior psychers whose minds are shielded against the worst horrors of the warp. And we made for the Hesperides sector with all speed. The journey through the Immaterium was turbulent, even by the standards of warp travel. The Geller field flickered 3 times during our transit, and each time I glimpsed something beyond the translucent barrier that separated us from the howling chaos outside. Figures in white robes standing upon clouds. A woman with a bow made of moonlight, hunting something vast and terrible through the Empyrean currents. A man with a helmet that covered his entire head, his chest bare and muscled, carrying a spear that dripped with blood that burned like stars. When we translated back into real space above the world of Thessalia Prime, the capital of the Hesperides sector, we found a system in turmoil. The Imperial Navy flotilla that should have been maintaining order was scattered, their vox channels filled with contradictory reports and panicked prayers. The planetary governor was dead, murdered by his own household staff who claimed they had received a divine vision. The Ecclesiarchy Cathedral in the primary hive had been desecrated, its icons of the emperor torn down and replaced with statues of beings wearing ancient armor and carrying weapons from Terra's pre-imperial past. And in the ruins of the astropathic relay station, we found 17 psychers arranged in a circle, their bodies unmarked, but their minds completely destroyed, burned out from the inside, as if they had tried to contain a sun within their skulls. The local Arbites precinct commander, a grizzled veteran named Castor Thrain, met us in the governor's palace throne room, now serving as a makeshift command center. He looked like he had not slept in weeks, his eyes bloodshot and his hands shaking as he poured himself a measure of amasec before briefing us. He said the situation had deteriorated beyond anything in his 40 years of service. Entire hab blocks had fallen under the sway of what he called the new prophets, preachers who spoke of a time before the emperor, before the Imperium, when humanity had been free to worship gods of their own choosing. These prophets performed miracles, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. They called down lightning from clear skies. They healed the sick with a touch. They made wine flow from fountains that had only ever dispensed recycled water. And worst of all, they spoke with absolute certainty about what lay in the warp, a realm they called Olympus, home of the 12, gods who had returned to guide humanity away from the path of suffering and into a new golden age. I ordered the Grey Knights to establish a perimeter around the palace, while I studied the evidence Thrain had compiled. Data slates filled with testimony from witnesses, picked captures showing impossible events. A woman walking unharmed through a plasma fire, a man lifting a chimera transport with his bare hands, children speaking in ancient Hellenic Greek, a language that had been dead for over 30 millennia, reciting poetry about heroes and monsters and gods who lived on a mountain that touched the sky. The most disturbing evidence was a series of recordings from the astropathic choir just before they perished. I played them on a secure cogitator, and the voice that emerged from the speakers made my blood run cold. It was not the usual psychic scream of someone touched by chaos. It was calm, measured, almost paternal. It spoke in perfect High Gothic, but with an accent that predated the unification of Terra under the Emperor. The voice said that humanity had forgotten its first gods, the ones who had shaped civilization and given meaning to existence long before the rise of the Imperium. It said these gods had waited in the warp, sustained by the collective memory of humanity encoded in our genetic heritage, dormant but never truly gone. And now, in this age of darkness and suffering, they had returned not as demons of chaos, but as beings of order and beauty, offering humanity a choice. Continue to worship a corpse god who demanded endless sacrifice and gave nothing in return, or embrace the Olympians, gods who rewarded courage, wisdom, and excellence with genuine divine favor. This was heresy of the highest order, and yet I could not simply dismiss it as the usual corruption of the Ruinous Powers. The voice on the recording exhibited none of the telltale signs of demonic influence. There was no mad laughter, no promises of excess or violence or despair. Instead, it spoke of justice and honor and the pursuit of human greatness. It acknowledged that the gods of Olympus were flawed, that they quarreled and schemed and made terrible mistakes. But it argued that this made them more honest than the emperor, who claimed perfection while overseeing an empire built on lies and suffering. I needed to see this phenomenon for myself. I ordered the Eternal Vigil to prepare for a warp observation mission, something that only the most desperate or insane members of the Inquisition attempt. We would enter the Immaterium with full Geller field protection, but position ourselves close enough to observe the structure that navigators claim to see. The Grey Knights blessed our vessel with every prayer and sanctification ritual in their arsenal. The tech priests performed maintenance on systems that had not been touched in centuries, ensuring that every fail-safe and redundancy was operational. And I prepared myself through meditation and fasting, clearing my mind of all doubt and fear so that I might witness the truth without falling to corruption. The translation into the warp was smooth by comparison to our previous journey. The Geller field activated without incident, and we drifted through the roiling colors and impossible geometries of the Immaterium, like a mote of light in an infinite ocean of madness. The navigator, a woman named Sophondra of House Belisarius, guided us with her warp eye, following the psychic beacon that drew so many others to their doom. She described what she saw through the viewing portals in gasps and whispers, her voice filled with awe rather than terror. She spoke of a mountain rising from a sea of golden clouds, its peak crowned with structures of white marble and bronze that gleamed with their own inner light. She described temples and palaces arranged in perfect geometric harmony, gardens filled with impossible flowers that bloomed in colors that did not exist in real space, and at the center of it all, a great hall where beings of terrible beauty held court. I moved to the observation deck, ignoring the protests of the ship's captain, who insisted it was suicide to look directly at the warp even through armored viewing ports. I needed to see. I needed to understand what we faced. The servitors monitoring the Geller field readouts reported stable parameters as I pressed my face against the reinforced glass and gazed out into the madness beyond. What I saw defied every teaching of the Imperium, every warning about the nature of the warp. There, suspended in the shifting unreality of the Immaterium, was a mountain of impossible scale. Not a metaphor or psychic projection, but an actual mountain with slopes of stone and forest that seemed more real than the steel deck beneath my feet. The clouds that surrounded its base were not the usual tortured faces and reaching claws of the warp, but genuine weather phenomena, white and gold and moving with the kind of natural patterns I had only seen on agri-worlds. And upon that mountain stood structures that I recognized from the ancient texts preserved in the inquisitorial archives, buildings from old Earth's classical period rendered in divine perfection. The Temple of Zeus dominated the summit, a structure of white marble columns that rose 50 meters into a sky that somehow existed within the warp itself. Lightning flickered around its roof, but not the sickly green discharge of warp storms. This was clean, blue-white electricity that crackled with power and purpose. Around the main temple stood smaller structures, each one dedicated to a different deity, whose names I remembered from forbidden texts. The Temple of Athena with its olive trees and bronze owl statues. The Forge of Hephaestus built into the mountainside, its chimneys belching real smoke rather than demonic essence. The Palace of Aphrodite surrounded by gardens of roses that should not exist in the realm of pure thought and emotion. And then I saw them, the gods themselves. They were not demons. I had fought the servants of the dark gods for 3 decades, and I knew the signs of corruption. These beings exhibited none of the usual markers. They did not radiate the sickly aura of Nurgle or the maddening contradiction of Sinch. They were not bound by the chains of violence that marked Khorne's champions or drowning in the excess that defined Slaanesh's servants. Instead, they simply existed, standing upon balconies and walking through gardens as if this were the most natural thing in the universe. The figure I took to be Zeus stood at the edge of a great balcony overlooking the warp itself. He was massive, easily 3 meters tall, with a physique that spoke of perfect physical conditioning rather than demonic mutation. His hair and beard were the color of storm clouds, and his eyes flickered with internal lightning. He wore a white chiton edged with gold, and in his right hand he held a spear that hummed with barely contained electrical fury. But it was his face that disturbed me most. It was neither cruel nor kind, neither benevolent nor malicious. It was simply powerful, the face of someone who commanded by right of strength rather than divine mandate. Beside him stood a woman in armor that would have made the Adeptus Custodes weep with envy. Bronze plates molded to her form without sacrificing functionality. A helmet topped with a blood-red crest, and in her hands, both spear and aegis shield decorated with the face of something that had once been human, but was now pure terror. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, and I could see the intelligence burning in her gray eyes even from this distance. She gestured toward something beyond my field of vision, speaking to Zeus with the confidence of an equal rather than a supplicant. More figures emerged from the palace complex. A woman with silver hair wearing robes that seemed woven from moonlight itself, carrying a bow of impossible craftsmanship. A man whose very presence radiated heat, his skin bronzed by fires that had nothing to do with suns or plasma reactors, carrying a lyre that somehow seemed as dangerous as any weapon. A figure in full armor the color of dried blood, his face hidden behind a helmet that bore no mercy, carrying a sword that dripped with essence, that might have been blood or might have been something worse. I watched them interact with each other, and what struck me was how human they seemed. Zeus and Hera, whom I identified by her crown of stars, argued with the kind of familiar hostility that spoke of 10,000 years of marriage. Apollo and Artemis, the twins of sun and moon, stood close together, planning something with their heads bent in conspiracy. Ares prowled the edges of the gathering like a caged predator, clearly bored with whatever council was taking place. Aphrodite lounged on a couch of living roses, her beauty so profound that even seeing her reflection in the warped glass made my heart ache with loss for something I had never possessed. Hephaestus limped from his forge, carrying something that blazed with inner fire, presenting it to the assembly with the pride of a craftsman showing his finest work. They were a family, dysfunctional certainly, prone to quarrels and schemes and betrayals undoubtedly, but a family nonetheless, bound together by ties of blood and history and shared purpose. And that made them more dangerous than any demon, because demons were simply manifestations of base emotions and dark impulses. These beings were complex, capable of both great good and terrible evil, driven by motivations that humanity could actually understand and therefore be tempted by. The vox-grille on my collar crackled with the voice of Brother Captain Artemio of the Grey Knights. He said that the Geller field was beginning to fluctuate, that we needed to return to real space immediately before the ship was compromised. I acknowledged his warning, but remained at the observation port for 3 more heartbeats, needing to see one final detail that would help me understand the magnitude of what we faced. At the base of Mount Olympus, where the golden clouds met the roiling chaos of normal warp currents, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Figures were climbing the mountain. Human figures. Men and women wearing the tattered uniforms of Imperial Guard regiments, the robes of Adeptus Ministorum priests, even the power armor of Space Marines with their chapter insignia carefully filed away. They climbed with determination, ignoring the demons that shrieked and clawed at the edges of the golden clouds, but could not penetrate that divine barrier. And at the top, the Olympians welcomed them. I saw Zeus himself extend a hand to a former guardsman, pulling him up the final step onto the marble plaza and speaking words I could not hear, but whose meaning was clear. "You are worthy. You are welcome. You are home." We translated back into real space, and I immediately ordered the ship to full quarantine protocols. No one who had witnessed the phenomenon could be allowed to spread what they had seen until I had time to process the implications. I retired to my private sanctum, a room lined with hexagrammic wards and psychic dampeners. And there, I spent 3 days in prayer and meditation, seeking guidance from the Emperor through the connection all servants of the Imperium share with his distant presence in the warp. The Emperor did not answer. Or perhaps he did, and I simply could not hear his voice over the sound of thunder and music drifting from a mountain that should not exist. When I emerged from my sanctum, the situation on Thessalia Prime had deteriorated beyond salvage. Brother Captain Artemio reported that the new prophets now controlled over 60% of the primary hive city. The Arbits had been overwhelmed, not through violence, but through simple mass conversion. Citizens who had spent their entire lives in faithful service to the Imperium were abandoning the imperial creed after a single conversation with these prophets, drawn by promises of gods who actually answered prayers, who rewarded genuine virtue rather than mindless obedience, who offered a path to excellence rather than mere survival. The most disturbing reports came from the remaining astropaths. Those who had not been destroyed by their proximity to Olympus reported that the phenomenon was spreading. New mountains were appearing in the warp at different locations throughout the sector. Smaller peaks that the prophets called the lesser shrines, dedicated to hero gods and spirits of place. The warp itself seemed to be crystallizing around these structures, forming stable pockets of relatively calm space that demons could not enter. It was as if the Olympians were claiming territory in the Immaterium, establishing a foothold from which they could exert influence over real space. I convened a war council aboard the Eternal Vigil, bringing together the ship's captain, the Grey Knight's leadership, and several tech priests specializing in warp phenomena. We discussed options, and every one of them seemed inadequate to the threat we faced. We could not simply destroy the phenomenon with cyclonic torpedoes because it existed primarily in the warp rather than real space. We could not cordon off the sector because the psychic influence of Olympus was spreading through the Immaterium itself, touching astropaths and navigators across multiple segmentums. And we could not fight the Olympians as we would fight demons, because they exhibited none of the usual weaknesses of warp entities. Brother Captain Artemio made the observation that troubled me most. He said that in all his decades of fighting the forces of chaos, he had never encountered warp entities that seemed genuinely interested in human welfare. The Ruinous Powers offered gifts, certainly, but always with the intention of corrupting and destroying the recipient. The Olympians, by contrast, seemed to operate under a different model. They rewarded excellence and punished hubris. They demanded worship, but also granted genuine boons. They were capricious and sometimes cruel, but never mindlessly destructive. In short, they behaved exactly as the ancient gods of old Earth had behaved according to the surviving texts, which raised a question that none of us wanted to ask. What if these were not demons pretending to be ancient gods? What if they were actually the gods humanity had worshipped before the rise of the Emperor, somehow preserved in the warp through 10,000 years of genetic memory and collective unconscious, now awakened by the sheer scale of suffering in the current age? I silenced that line of inquiry immediately. Such thoughts bordered on heresy, and I could not allow my team to fall into doubt while we still had work to do. But alone in my sanctum that night, I opened a data slate containing forbidden texts from the inquisitorial archives and read accounts of how the emperor had unified Terra during the Age of Strife. The history spoke of him destroying the old religions, casting down their temples and scattering their priesthoods, declaring himself the only truth humanity needed. But nowhere in those accounts did the emperor actually deny the existence of those older gods. He simply declared them irrelevant, powerless, unworthy of worship in the new age he was creating. What if he had been wrong? Or worse, what if he had known the truth and concealed it because acknowledging the existence of other divine beings would undermine the absolute authority he needed to build the Imperium? I am not a heretic. I have served the throne faithfully for 6 decades. I have executed thousands of traitors and witches and mutants in the Emperor's name. But as I sat in that darkened room reading words that should have been destroyed millennia ago, I felt doubt creeping into my heart like frost spreading across a window pane. The Emperor demands everything from us and gives only the barest scraps of guidance in return. The Olympians, for all their flaws and capriciousness, seemed to offer something the Imperium had not provided in 10,000 years: the possibility of actually being heard by one's gods. The next morning, I received an astropathic communication from the Chamber of Vigilance on Terra. Lord Inquisitor Hadrian had reviewed my initial reports and was dispatching reinforcements, including 3 companies of Grey Knights, an entire battle fleet, and representatives from the Adeptus Custodes themselves. The message was clear. The Olympian phenomenon was now considered a threat on par with the emergence of a new warp rift or the manifestation of a demon Primarch. The Imperium would commit whatever resources necessary to eliminate this heresy before it spread beyond containment. But there was a second message encoded in the same transmission, this one for my eyes only. Hadrian wrote that the custodians were particularly interested in the Olympian phenomenon because it touched on secrets that dated back to the Unification Wars. He could not say more through astropathic channels, but he urged me to exercise extreme caution in any further investigations. He wrote that the Emperor himself might have opinions on this matter that the Inquisition was not privy to, and that I should be prepared to receive orders that seemed to contradict standard protocols for dealing with warp phenomena. I did not understand what he meant until I led a raid on one of the largest New Prophet gatherings in the Underhive of Thessalia Prime. We struck at dawn, the Grey Knights forming a perimeter, while I and a team of stormtroopers moved through the crowd of worshippers who had assembled in what had once been a reclamation facility. They were ordinary citizens, not cultists. No mutations, no demonic marks, no signs of the usual corruption. They simply knelt before a makeshift altar, singing hymns in that ancient language, calling on Zeus and Athena and Apollo to witness their devotion. The prophet leading the service was a woman who had once served as a senior scribe in the administratum. Her name was Lydia Karst, and according to the Arbit's files, she had been an exemplary servant of the Imperium for 35 years before her conversion. She saw us enter and did not flee or call for violence. Instead, she stood calmly, her hands clasped before her, and waited for me to approach. I demanded to know what had caused her to abandon the Imperial Creed. She smiled, and it was not the mad grin of a heretic drunk on the promises of chaos. It was the peaceful expression of someone who had found genuine faith after a lifetime of doubt. She said that she had always performed her duties but never felt the presence of the God Emperor, never received any sign that her prayers were heard, never experienced anything but the grinding machinery of the Imperium, demanding more and more of her with no hope of respite or reward. And then one night, she had dreamed of standing on a mountain under a sky full of stars, and a woman in armor had spoken to her, telling her that she was worthy of being seen as more than a cog in a vast machine. Athena, Lydia said reverently, had given her knowledge that transformed her work from drudgery into art. The goddess of wisdom had shown her patterns in the data flows she processed, connections that no one else had noticed, insights that improved the efficiency of her department by 30%. And all Athena had asked in return was acknowledgement. Not mindless obedience, not the sacrifice of her firstborn. Simply recognition that the divine existed and took interest in human affairs, and that humanity could achieve greatness when guided by gods who actually cared about excellence rather than mere survival. I asked her if she understood that what she was doing was heresy, that the emperor was the only god humanity could safely worship, that these Olympians were either demons in disguise or psychic constructs born from the warp's tendency to give form to human belief. She listened to my arguments with patience, and when I finished, she asked me a question that I am still trying to answer weeks later. She asked if I had ever actually felt the emperor's presence. Not the distant sense of his power emanating from the golden throne, not the abstract knowledge that he sustained the Astronomicon, but genuine presence, the feeling of being seen and known and valued by the being I devoted my life to serving. She asked if I had ever prayed and received an answer, ever performed a deed and felt divine approval, ever suffered and felt divine comfort. She asked if the emperor had ever once treated me as anything more than a tool to be used and discarded when broken. I struck her across the face with my power fist set to minimum charge. The blow shattered her jaw and sent her sprawling across the floor. The crowd of worshippers gasped but did not attack us. They simply knelt and began to pray, calling on their gods to witness the cruelty of the Imperium, to see how servants of the corpse emperor responded to truth with violence because they had no other response available. We arrested Lydia and 36 other prophets that day, dragging them back to the eternal vigil for interrogation and eventual execution. But as we lifted off from the underhive, I looked down at the crowd of worshippers we had left behind, and I saw them raising their hands toward the sky in a gesture I recognized from ancient pict captures. They were calling down the presence of their gods, and for just a moment, I swore I saw lightning flicker in the clouds above them, and I heard thunder that sounded like laughter. The interrogations proved useless. The prophets we captured exhibited no signs of psychic possession or mental conditioning. They simply believed, with a kind of unshakable faith that should only be reserved for the emperor. We tried every method of persuasion and coercion short of outright torture, and they remained calmly certain that they had been touched by genuine divinity. The most disturbing moment came when I personally questioned a former space marine of the Howling Griffins chapter, who had renounced his oaths and declared himself a servant of Ares. His name had been Brother Sergeant Marcus Calliston, and he had served his chapter with distinction for over a century before deserting during a campaign in the Hesperides Sector. I asked him how he could abandon the Emperor and his Primarch for a warp entity whose very existence was an affront to everything the Imperium stood for. He looked at me with eyes that held no madness, only certainty. And he said that Ares had given him something that the Emperor never had: honest acknowledgement of what he was. Marcus said that he had been created to be a weapon, turned from a human child into a killing machine through surgery and conditioning and indoctrination so complete that he could barely remember his life before the chapter took him. The Emperor and his Primarchs used him as a tool of war, spending his life in battles that served distant strategic objectives he would never fully understand. And in return, he received only the promise that his suffering meant something in the grand scheme of the Imperium's survival. But Ares, the god of war himself, had looked upon Marcus and said something revolutionary. that warfare was not a necessary evil or a sacrifice demanded by duty, but a valid path to excellence when practiced with honor and skill. Ares did not promise Marcus peace or redemption or a higher purpose. The god of war simply acknowledged that some souls were born to fight, that there was beauty in the dance of blades and honor in testing oneself against worthy opponents, and that a warrior could serve the divine by being the best warrior possible, rather than by dying for someone else's vision of civilization. Marcus had laid down his bolter and chainsword at the foot of an altar that materialized in the warp during a fleet transit. And Ares had returned them transformed, weapons that would never jam or run out of ammunition as long as Marcus fought with genuine commitment rather than mere obedience. I had Marcus executed immediately after the interrogation, not because he was corrupted or dangerous, though he was certainly both, but because I could not risk allowing him to live and speak further. His words carried a seductive logic that might sway others, and I had already seen too many servants of the Imperium question their faith after encountering the Olympian phenomenon. The reinforcements from Terra arrived 6 weeks later, and with them came a figure who made even the Grey Knights bow in respect. Custodian Tribune Valdor Antares, one of the Golden Guardians who had stood beside the Emperor since the Unification Wars, strode aboard the Eternal Vigil wearing armor that had been ancient when my grandfather was born. He dismissed everyone from the Strategium except myself and brother Captain Artemio, sealed the room with wards that made the air taste of ozone, and then spoke words that I am forbidden to record in any official document, but will write here because this account may be the only true record of what actually happened in the Hesperides Sector. Valdor said that the Emperor had known this day might come. During the Unification Wars, when he walked openly among humanity and wielded powers that made him appear divine, the Emperor had encountered the remnants of the old religions and found them to be more than simple superstition. The gods of old Earth had been real, or at least as real as anything that exists in the warp can be claimed to be. They were not demons in the sense we understand the term, not manifestations of the chaos gods, but rather emergent entities created from the collective belief and psychic resonance of ancient humanity. They had possessed genuine power to affect real space, granting boons and curses, intervening in human affairs with the capriciousness that comes from beings who exist beyond mortal consequence. The Emperor had destroyed them, or so he believed. He had starved them of worship, broken their cults, scattered the knowledge of their rites and prayers, without human belief to sustain them in the warp. These entities should have faded into nothingness, their essence dissolving back into the formless chaos of the Immaterium. But the Emperor had miscalculated. He had not accounted for the power of genetic memory, the way trauma and belief can be encoded into human DNA and passed down through generations. Every human being carries within them the echoes of their ancestors, and enough of humanity's ancestors had believed in the Olympians that those beliefs could not simply be erased by 10,000 years of imperial indoctrination. The Great Rift had changed everything. When Cadia fell and the galaxy was split in half by warp storms of unprecedented magnitude, the Immaterium convulsed with new possibilities. Old things long thought dead stirred in the depths. And the Olympians, sustained all this time by the faintest whisper of genetic memory, found themselves suddenly fed by the desperation of countless trillions of humans who cried out for gods who might actually answer them. The warp does not care about what should or should not exist. It cares only about belief and emotion and the power they generate. And humanity's grief and suffering in the age of the Dark Imperium was more than enough to resurrect beings who had slept for 100 centuries. Valdor told us that the Emperor had foreseen this possibility and left instructions for how to handle the return of the old gods. Those instructions were not what I expected. We were not ordered to destroy Olympus or wage war on the Olympians. Instead, Valdor said that we were to observe and contain, but not to engage, unless they directly threatened Terra or the Astronomicon. The Emperor, even now sitting immobile upon the golden throne, apparently believed that humanity needed some valve for its desperation, some alternative to falling to chaos. And if the Olympians could provide that alternative, drawing believers away from the ruinous powers while not directly threatening the Imperium's strategic infrastructure, then they might serve a useful purpose in the grand scheme of the Emperor's designs. I protested this logic with every argument I could muster. I said that allowing any worship besides devotion to the Emperor would undermine the very foundations of the Imperium. I said that the Olympians were just as dangerous as the Chaos Gods, perhaps more so because they offered temptation wrapped in beauty rather than obvious corruption. I said that we had a duty to purge this heresy before it spread beyond control. Brother Captain Artemio stood silent beside me, but I could feel his agreement in the tension of his stance. Valdor listened to my protests with the patience of someone who had heard these arguments 10,000 times before and found them wanting. He said that the Imperium's greatest weakness had always been its inflexibility, its insistence that there was only one true path and all others led to damnation. The Emperor had built an empire on that principle, but empires built on single points of failure eventually collapse under their own weight. The emergence of the Olympians was a test, Valdor said, of whether humanity could survive with divided loyalties, whether the Imperium was strong enough to endure even when some of its citizens chose to seek divine guidance from gods who were not the Emperor. And if the Imperium could not survive that test, Valdor said quietly, then perhaps it deserved to fall. I spent that night pacing my sanctum, unable to find peace or clarity. Everything I had believed about my purpose, about the Imperium's righteous supremacy, about the Emperor's exclusive claim to divinity, had been shaken to its foundations. I thought about Lydia Karst and her simple desire to be seen by the gods she served. I thought about Marcus Calliston and his need to have his nature acknowledged rather than exploited. I thought about the millions of people across the Hesperides Sector who were abandoning the imperial creed not out of rebellion or corruption, but out of genuine spiritual hunger. And I thought about myself, kneeling in this sanctum for 6 decades, praying to an emperor who had never once given me any sign that he heard my prayers or cared about my service beyond the utility it provided to his grand design. The next morning, I made my decision. I sent a coded message to Lord Inquisitor Cardi, informing him that I was resigning my position in the Ordo Malleus, effective immediately. I would not fight the Olympians. I would not help contain or observe them. I would simply step away from the conflict entirely and seek whatever truth I could find in the years remaining to me. If the Inquisition deemed me a traitor for this choice, then I would accept that judgment and face whatever punishment they deemed appropriate. Valdor found me in the docking bay as I was preparing to take a shuttle down to Thessalia Prime. He did not try to stop me or convince me to reconsider. He simply handed me a data slate containing a message from the Golden Throne itself, delivered through whatever means the custodians used to maintain their connection with the Emperor. I read the message 3 times, and with each reading, I felt my understanding of the universe shift. The Emperor's message said that faith was not meant to be comfortable or simple. It was meant to be tested, challenged, refined through struggle and doubt. The Olympians were not enemies to be destroyed, but questions to be answered. tests to determine whether humanity could evolve beyond blind obedience into something more complex and mature. The Imperium had always been a chrysalis, the Emperor wrote, a structure that protected humanity during its vulnerable transformation, but was never meant to be permanent. And perhaps the return of the old gods was the first crack in that chrysalis, the sign that humanity was ready to emerge into something new. Or perhaps it was the beginning of the end, the final fracturing of humanity's unity that would lead to the extinction the Emperor had fought 10,000 years to prevent. The message did not offer certainty. It only offered the acknowledgement that even the Emperor did not know how this test would end, and that each individual human would have to decide for themselves which path to walk. I took the shuttle down to Thessalia Prime and made my way to the largest temple of the new prophets, a converted manufactorum where thousands gathered daily to worship the Olympians. I did not go as an inquisitor or an agent of the throne. I went as simply Hadrian, a man who had served faithfully for 6 decades and needed to know if the gods I had ignored all my life could see me more clearly than the god emperor I had served. The temple was beautiful in a way imperial architecture never attempted. Where our cathedrals emphasized the insignificance of humanity before the divine, this space celebrated human potential. The walls were decorated with frescoes showing mortals achieving greatness through divine favor. Athletes and artists and warriors and scholars all reaching heights of excellence that the Imperium would have dismissed as impossible or irrelevant. The altar at the center of the temple held statues of the 12 Olympians arranged in a circle, each one unique and detailed, capturing not just physical perfection, but personality and character. I knelt before that altar, alone in the temple after the morning service had ended, and I did something I had not done in years. I prayed not out of duty or ritual, but out of genuine need. I asked the Olympians if they could see me, if they knew the doubt and fear and longing that I had carried for so long, if they had any answer to the question that had haunted me since the first time I looked upon their mountain in the warp. The air around the altar shimmered, and a figure appeared before me. She was not massive like Zeus or terrible like Ares. She was simply present, more real than anything else in the temple, wearing robes the color of owls' wings and carrying a spear that hummed with potential energy. Athena, goddess of wisdom, looked at me with eyes that saw everything I had ever done and every thought I had ever concealed. And she smiled with something that might have been compassion or might have been amusement at my predicament. She spoke, and her voice was clear and warm and entirely unlike the psychic scream of demons or the cold certainty of imperial doctrine. She said that I had served faithfully, that my doubt was not weakness, but the beginning of wisdom, and that the question I needed to answer was not which gods were real or worthy of worship, but what kind of universe I wanted to live in. Did I want one where humanity existed only to serve the designs of distant powers who might be divine or might simply be very old and very powerful? Or did I want one where humans could pursue excellence and be acknowledged by beings who remembered what it meant to be worthy of admiration? She said that the Olympians were not perfect, that they would quarrel and scheme and sometimes behave in ways that seemed petty or cruel to mortal eyes. But they would also reward genuine virtue when they saw it, and they would never demand that humanity sacrifice everything while receiving nothing in return. They offered a compact rather than commandments, a relationship rather than absolute obedience. I asked her if she was real or if I was simply experiencing a psychic projection born from my own desperate need to believe in something beyond the Imperium's grinding machinery. Athena laughed, and it was the sound of wind through olive groves. And she said that reality was a more complicated concept than I was allowing for. She was as real as any being shaped by belief and sustained by worship could be, which was to say both absolutely genuine and entirely dependent on whether humans chose to acknowledge her existence. The warp made no distinction between material and psychic reality. All that mattered was power and purpose. She placed her hand on my head, and I felt something shift inside my mind. Not corruption or possession, simply clarity. I understood suddenly that I had been asking the wrong questions all along. The issue was not whether the Emperor or the Olympians were the true gods. The issue was that humanity needed to choose what kind of relationship it wanted with the divine, and that choice would shape the future of our species as much as any battle or technological advancement. I stood, and Athena faded back into whatever dimension she had emerged from, and I walked out of the temple into the afternoon light of Thessalia Prime. The city around me continued its daily struggles. Hive workers and administratum scribes and Arbites patrols all going about their business in a world that no longer made sense according to the old rules. And somewhere high above, beyond the clouds and atmosphere, Mount Olympus hung in the warp, visible to anyone with the right kind of sight, calling to humanity with promises of recognition and purpose, and the possibility that we might be something more than raw material for the Imperium's endless wars. I do not know how this will end. The Inquisition may declare me a heretic and send assassins to ensure I cannot spread what I have learned. The Olympians may prove to be just as cruel and demanding as the Emperor, their initial benevolence giving way to the same patterns of exploitation that have defined every religion humanity has ever practiced. Or perhaps we are witnessing the birth of something genuinely new, a third path between the mindless obedience demanded by the Imperium and the utter corruption offered by chaos. I am recording this account and hiding copies in locations where they might be found by those who come after, whether in decades or centuries. Future servants of the Imperium need to know that the universe is more complex than the ecclesiarchy teaches, that the warp contains more than just demons and the Emperor's psychic presence, and that humanity's relationship with the divine is not settled simply because the Imperium has lasted 10,000 years. The Olympians have returned, rising from the collective unconscious of humanity, like ancient mountains emerging from a receding sea. They offer us a choice that we have not had since the Emperor unified Terra under his banner. We can continue to serve the corpse Emperor on his golden throne, sustaining him with countless sacrifices while receiving only the barest trickle of guidance in return. Or we can acknowledge that other gods exist, that they remember us even when we forget them, and that they might offer paths to human greatness that the Imperium has systematically destroyed in its pursuit of uniformity and control. I choose neither. I choose to witness and record and try to understand what is happening to our species in this age of darkness and transformation. I will not worship the Olympians simply because they can see me more clearly than the Emperor ever did. But neither will I return to the comforting certainty of imperial doctrine, not after seeing how hollow that certainty has become. The galaxy is burning. The Great Rift has split reality in ways that make all our old assumptions obsolete. And now, the gods of ancient Terra have risen from their grave of collective forgetting to offer humanity a choice that may determine whether we survive as a species or finally succumb to the darkness that has been closing in for 10,000 years. I write this from a hab unit in the mid-levels of Thessalia Prime, having shed my inquisitorial regalia and taken on the identity of a simple scholar studying the sociological impact of the new province. I do not know how long I will remain undetected, but for now, I watch and listen and try to understand what it means that Mount Olympus stands in the warp, its marbled temples gleaming with light that should not exist, its divine inhabitants playing out dramas that shaped human civilization before the Emperor was born. The thunder rolls across the sky even on clear days now, and sometimes I swear I can hear music drifting down from clouds that touch the upper hive spires. The old gods are awake, and they remember us even though we tried to forget them. What we choose to do with that knowledge will echo through the millennia to come, shaping the fate of humanity in ways that even the Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, might not have foreseen. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But perhaps, just perhaps, there's also the possibility of being seen by the gods we serve, of having our struggles acknowledged, of pursuing excellence rather than mere survival. The Olympians offer that possibility, wrapped in beauty and danger and the kind of ancient power that predates the Imperium itself. I do not know if that possibility is salvation or damnation. I know only that it exists, and that choice has returned to humanity after 10,000 years of having no choice at all.